Desirée, a very warm welcome to Straight Talk Africa. Great to have you here. And this is not the first time you and I are talking.
No, it's not.
You've been featured on the show before. Desirée, please tell us again, just as a refresher for people, about your role and responsibilities as the U.S. Special Representative on Racial Equity and Justice.
Well, thanks again for having me. You were my first media interview in this role.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So you will always have a special place in my heart, and it's great to be back today talking about such an important and historic moment. So when I spoke to you, I think I was on the job for maybe 1 or 2 weeks.
Correct.
I have now been on the job for a whole 6 months. So I do have a little bit more to report, which I'm really excited about. As you mentioned, this is a new and historic role for the State Department. It's the first time that we have had a senior level representative focused on combating structural racism, xenophobia, and discrimination based on race and ethnicity globally. And my mandate is twofold. It is first to ensure that U.S. foreign policy, processes, assistance, and programs serves to promote and protect the human rights of members of marginalized racial and ethnic and indigenous communities. That includes people of African descent. It is also to ensure that U.S. foreign policy, processes, programs, assistance is serving to combat structural racism, xenophobia, and discrimination worldwide. And that is not because we have solved these problems here at home. Let me be very clear about that. We are very much still grappling with these challenges in the United States. But my role was established because we recognize that these are global challenges, and they will require coordinated and sustained global solutions to actually solve.
Well, yes, I mean, all the things that you're meant to tackle and will be working on is also just indicative of how deep these problems are. And we do see, Desirée, hate crimes, xenophobic sentiment, anti-immigrant rhetoric on the rise everywhere from countries in Europe, in the United States, and even the country that I am from, South Africa. What worries you most about the trends that you're seeing right now?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is a global trend, and it is extremely worrying. We're seeing a rise not only in anti-Black racism, we're also seeing a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Roma racism in Europe. This is extremely concerning. Just last week, the White House, or the week before, the White House had an entire conversation about the rise of anti-Semitism here in the United States, but also globally, and to reaffirm our commitment to combating the rise in this hate. And I want to underscore the really close connection between anti-Semitism and racism. As my counterpart, Ambassador Deborah Lipstadt, the U.S. ambassador to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, always says, anti-Semitism and racism are two sides of the same coin. You can't fight one without fighting the other. It just doesn't work. They're deeply interconnected. And so we are committed to working together to not only combat anti-Semitism, but to also combat the other worrying rise that we are seeing in racism and xenophobia globally.
And so now, Desirée, the United Nations established the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. Can you give us some insight into what exactly this forum is meant to accomplish?
Yeah, well, it's an exciting time. This is a historic forum, and it was launched in December, as you mentioned, earlier this month in Geneva. And I must say, it was the first time I felt such a palatable joy and excitement in the United Nations. And I'm really glad about that, because there are very real challenges and persistent challenges and inequities that face people of African descent around the world. But there should also be a space to recognize the resilience, the contributions, the diversity, and the beauty of people of African descent from around the world. So I think the forum, the launch, did a really good job of making sure that there was space and time given to both of these priorities. And in fact, it kicked off, and I don't know if this was the first time or if this is normal, but it was the first time I'd seen a UN meeting being kicked off with music and a celebration and a performance by an Afro-Latino band. And I can't even remember which country the band was from, because it just felt very familiar. You can hear the influences from the African continent. You can hear the influences of Latin culture and music. You could also hear the influences of Black American jazz, and it was so beautiful and just a joyous occasion. But you know, there were very real things discussed, but a lot of challenges and persistent inequities that face people of African descent on the continent and across the diaspora around the world. And so I'm really excited about this forum. This forum in and of itself is not going to be a magic bullet to solve all of these problems, but I'm most excited about it because it does create a space where civil society, people of African descent, member states, and other stakeholders can come and convene and discuss the real challenges, but also provide real solutions to these challenges as a consultative body to member states on how to address these challenges in a meaningful and impactful way.
You know, the excitement that you're exuding here is so infectious. I hate to be a downer on this, but you know, Desirée, all of this, and even as I was working on the questions to ask you, it really made me think about where I come from, a country that even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. believed was home to the worst racism in the world. These are hard things to address. These are hard things to eliminate, and these are hard things to reconcile.
That's right.
There's generational pain
Yes.
that people deal with on a daily basis. There are communities, indigenous and ethnic communities whose suffering has probably never even been recognized in places, much less addressed. When you go around in this role and the people that you interact with, both abroad and at home, what is your message to them about how do we overcome this? It is so intractable, and if you live with it day to day, how can you possibly see that there can be an end to racism? Because at the same time, you're seeing these trends that it's only getting worse in some places. And it's a very real reality for people everywhere they go. What's your message to them? It must be a hard message to give.
It is a hard message, but you can't do this work without hope. Without hope that there can be a brighter future, that there can be a better future. And so the message I give to them is that I see you and I feel your pain is valid. A lot of these communities, whether they be people of African descent, indigenous peoples, Roma, or other marginalized ethnic communities, a lot of their struggles emanate from the fact that they feel invisible. They feel unseen, they feel erased. And so a major part of their struggle is just fighting for acknowledgement and recognition that they are a part of their country, that they have contributed to their country's history and current society, and that they matter. And so oftentimes, as simple as it may sound, having a visit and meeting with a senior level U.S. government official and meeting them where they are in their communities and really starting that conversation by acknowledging their pain, by acknowledging the inequities, and that those inequities are wrong and should stop, and that I want to hear from them about the challenges that they're facing because they know better than I do. They know better than anyone what the challenges they face are and what they need to overcome them. So to start by acknowledging that and acknowledging their agency and just listening, that in and of itself, I've heard has been quite powerful. Now again, that in and of itself is not going to solve their challenges, but my work has to start by listening to these communities and engaging with them, and then taking into account their feedback and their input into U.S. policy making in a meaningful way, not as a token, not as sort of window dressing, but in a real substantive and meaningful and ongoing way.
And Desirée, listening to you, I mean, I can see why you were picked for this role. We do not have a lot of time, but I just quickly want to get your take on the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. What's your assessment of how it went?
I think by all accounts, it was a huge success. I'm incredibly proud of my colleagues who have been planning this for years. This has been years in the making and something that many of us across the diaspora have been calling for, and we're really disappointed to see it hasn't happened since 2014, right? I think there was a lot of excitement and momentum from 2014, and then a lot of that has dissipated because of, you know, just political churn within the United States. But I think this summit sent a very strong and clear and powerful message that this administration cares about Africa and that we want to be equal partners with Africa, because Africa will shape the future. not just Africa's future, but the future of the globe. And there's not one global challenge, whether it be COVID-19, food insecurity, democratic backsliding, that can be addressed without the leadership of Africa. I will also note that, again, going back to the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, I think that's another exciting space that really needs Africa's leadership. And 3 of the 10 members of the Permanent Forum are from the continent, including Kenya's ambassador to the United Nations. And so I think it's really important to underscore that that permanent forum is not just for people outside of the continent of African descent, it is also for Africans. And I think if it serves as a unifying force between people of African descent on the continent and around the globe, it can be incredibly powerful to actually combat anti-Black racism.
Wow, fantastic. Desirée Cormier Smith, the U.S. Special Representative on Racial Equity and Justice. Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.